The evening air was thick with tension as people filled every seat in the community center's main hall. It was one of those nights where you could feel the electricity in the room before anything even started. Cars had been pulling into the parking lot for over an hour, their headlights cutting through the darkness as families, students, and longtime residents made their way inside. Pam Bondi was scheduled to speak at 7:30, but by 7 o'clock there wasn't an empty chair to be found. People stood along the walls, some even sitting on the floor near the back. The buzz of conversation filled the space as neighbors who hadn't spoken in months found themselves shoulder to shoulder, united by curiosity about what the evening would bring. At the front of the room, a simple podium waited under bright lights that had been hastily set up by the local news crew. The banner behind it read, "Community Voices Town Hall," in bold blue letters, but everyone knew this wasn't going to be just another polite discussion about local issues. Word had spread quickly through social media and coffee shop conversations that tonight was going to be different. Bondi had served as Florida's Attorney General for 8 years, making decisions that affected millions of people. Some loved her for taking tough stands on crime and corruption. Others criticized her for positions they felt were too harsh or unfair. Tonight, she was back in her home state as a private citizen, invited to discuss justice reform with regular folks who had strong opinions about her record. The crowd was as diverse as you'd find anywhere in modern America. Retired teachers sat next to college students. Small business owners chatted with social workers. There were people in work clothes who had come straight from their jobs, and others dressed up like they were heading to church. What they all shared was a sense that tonight mattered. A woman in her 60s adjusted her glasses and clutched a small notebook filled with questions she'd written down. She had followed Bondi's career closely and had strong feelings about some of the cases that had made headlines. Next to her, a young father bounced his toddler on his knee while checking his phone, making sure his wife knew he'd made it to the event safely. Near the middle of the room, a group of law students had claimed an entire row. They had driven 2 hours from their university, eager to see someone they'd studied in their criminal justice classes speak in person. Some admired her track record, while others came ready to challenge positions they disagreed with. Their professor had encouraged them to attend, saying it would be more educational than any textbook. The local news anchors were setting up their cameras when the moderator finally took the stage. Patricia Williams had been chosen specifically because everyone respected her fairness. As a longtime journalist who had covered politics in the state for decades, she knew how to ask tough questions while keeping things civil. "Good evening, everyone," Patricia said into the microphone, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Thank you all for coming out tonight. I can see we have a packed house, which shows how much this community cares about the important issues we'll be discussing." The room gradually quieted, but you could still feel the energy crackling beneath the surface. Patricia continued, "Before we bring out our speaker, I want to remind everyone that this is a respectful forum for dialogue. We encourage tough questions, but we ask that everyone maintain the courtesy that makes productive conversation possible." A few people nodded, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Social media had been buzzing for weeks about this event, with some calling for protesters and others organizing supporters. The police had even assigned extra officers to patrol the area, though everything had remained peaceful so far. "Our guest tonight needs no introduction to most of you," Patricia went on. "Pam Bondi served as our state's Attorney General from 2011 to 2019, handling some of the most challenging legal issues of our time. She's prosecuted major fraud cases, fought against human trafficking, and taken stands on issues that have shaped our state's legal landscape." As Patricia spoke, you could see people reacting differently to each accomplishment she mentioned. Some faces lit up with approval, while others remained stone-faced or even frowned. The division in the room was obvious, making the evening feel like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Tonight, she's here as a private citizen to discuss justice reform and to answer your questions about her approach to law enforcement and legal policy. She specifically asked that no topic be off limits, which I think shows the kind of open dialogue we're hoping to have. The anticipation was almost unbearable now. Cameras focused on the entrance where Bondi would appear, while people in the audience pulled out their phones to record what they expected would be memorable moments. Some had come hoping to finally get answers to questions that had bothered them for years. Others were there to show support for someone they believed had served the state well. A door at the side of the room opened, and Pam Bondi walked in. Moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and press conferences, but there was something different about her tonight. Maybe it was the casual blazer instead of a formal suit, or the way she smiled and nodded at people in the crowd before reaching the stage dot as she approached the podium. The applause was mixed. About half the room clapped enthusiastically, while the other half remained silent or offered only polite acknowledgement. It was exactly the kind of divided reception that everyone had expected. Bondi adjusted the microphone and looked out over the crowd. "Thank you, Patricia, and thank you all for being here tonight. I have to say, it's impressive to see this many people turn out on a Thursday evening to talk about justice and legal policy. That says something wonderful about this community." Her voice carried easily through the room, and despite the mixed feelings about her presence, people found themselves listening. There was something about her tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a typical political speech, filled with talking points and rehearsed answers. "I know many of you have questions about decisions I made during my time as Attorney General," she continued. "Some of you probably agree with those decisions, and some of you probably don't. That's not just okay, it's exactly why we need to have conversations like this one." The room was completely quiet now, with hundreds of people hanging on every word. Even the news cameras seemed to zoom in closer, sensing that something important was about to unfold. I've spent the last few years thinking a lot about justice, about what it really means to serve the people, and about how we can do better. I don't have all the answers, but I'm here tonight because I believe in the power of honest conversation to help us find better solutions together. You could feel the room starting to lean in, even those who had come skeptical or hostile. There was something genuine in her voice that cut through the usual political rhetoric. Patricia stepped forward, ready to begin the question and answer session that everyone knew would define the evening. The stage was set, the crowd was ready, and everyone in that packed community center could sense that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Patricia Williams stepped forward with her first question, something safe about current trends in criminal justice reform. Bondi answered smoothly, discussing rehabilitation programs and community partnerships. A few people nodded approvingly, and for a moment, it seemed like the evening might proceed without the fireworks everyone had expected, but that calm didn't last long. When Patricia opened the floor for audience questions, hands shot up across the room like rockets. The energy shifted immediately, and you could feel the temperature in the room rise several degrees. Patricia chose a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt who had been waving his hand enthusiastically. "Miss Bondi," he said, standing up and clearing his throat, "I want to know about the Henderson case from 2016. You had a chance to show mercy to a first-time offender, but you pushed for the maximum sentence. That young man is still in prison today because of your decision. How do you sleep at night knowing you destroyed a family over a mistake?" The question hit like a slap across the face. Bondi's expression remained composed, but you could see her grip tightened slightly on the podium. She began to answer, talking about the importance of following the law and considering public safety, but her response felt rehearsed and distant. Before she could finish, another hand went up. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes stood without being called on. "That's exactly the problem," she interrupted. "You talk about the law like it's some kind of religion, but what about justice? What about understanding that people make mistakes and deserve second chances?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement while others looked uncomfortable with the interruption. Patricia tried to restore order, but the dam had broken. Questions were coming faster now, and they were getting more personal. A college student near the front raised her hand and waited to be acknowledged. Miss Bondi, during your time as Attorney General, you took positions on several cases that seemed to target specific communities. How can you claim to represent all people when your actions suggested you saw some people as less deserving of justice than others? The room grew noticeably quieter, but the tension was thicker than before. Bondi straightened her shoulders and attempted to address the question directly, but her answer came across as defensive. She talked about equal application of the law and her duty to prosecute cases without favor, but the words felt hollow in the charged atmosphere. That's when things really started to heat up. An older gentleman in the back of the room stood up, his voice carrying clearly across the space. "I've been a police officer in this community for 32 years, he said. I've seen what happens when prosecutors care more about their win records than about what's right. You built your reputation on being tough, but being tough isn't the same as being just." The applause that followed was scattered but genuine. Several people clapped, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bondi's face showed the first real crack in her composure. She started to respond, but another voice cut her off. "My son was 17 when he made the worst mistake of his life," a woman called out from the side of the room. Her voice was shaking, but she continued. "He's been paying for it ever since." The prosecutor in his case said they were following your office's guidelines when they decided to try him as an adult. He's 25 now, and he's never had a real chance at life because of policies you supported. The room was electric now. People were looking around at each other, some with sympathy, others with skepticism. The news cameras panned across the crowd, capturing faces that showed the deep divisions in the room. Bondi tried to regain control of the situation. "I understand that individual cases can be heartbreaking," she said, her voice slightly strained. "But as Attorney General, I had to make decisions based on the law and the facts presented to me. I couldn't let personal feelings override my duty to protect the public, but the crowd wasn't buying it anymore." A young man in a hoodie stood up, his voice angry but controlled. "That's the problem right there. You keep talking about duty and law like they're more important than people's lives. You had the power to make a difference, and you chose to make examples instead." The moderator tried to step in, but the questions kept coming. A woman with graying hair and a determined expression stood up. "Ms. Bondi, I want to know about your core beliefs. Not your political positions or your legal philosophy, but what you actually believe about justice and mercy and second chances. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you believe some people matter more than others." The question hung in the air like a challenge. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about character, about the kind of person Pam Bondi really was beneath the polished exterior she presented to the world. "Do you really believe that a teenager who makes one terrible mistake should have his entire future destroyed?" The woman continued. "Do you believe that poverty and desperation should be punished the same way as calculated greed? Do you believe that the color of someone's skin or the size of their bank account should determine what kind of justice they receive?" The room was completely silent now. Every eye was on Bondi, waiting for her response. The cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing every micro-expression as she processed the weight of what had just been asked. Another voice joined in from across the room. "We're not asking about legal precedent or prosecutorial guidelines," man said. "We're asking about your heart. We're asking what you believe about forgiveness and redemption and whether people can change." The questions were coming from all directions now. A teacher asked about juvenile justice. A social worker questioned mandatory minimum sentences. A retired judge challenged her approach to drug cases. Each question was more pointed than the last, and each one seemed to chip away at the carefully constructed wall between Bondi's public persona and her private beliefs. You could see the strain on her face now. Her hands gripped the podium tighter, and her breathing had become slightly labored. The polished politician was being stripped away layer by layer, under the relentless pressure of people who genuinely wanted to understand who she really was. The final question came from a young mother holding a baby. "Miss Bondi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the room, "if this was your child, If this was your family member? If this was someone you loved who made a mistake, would you still believe that? Mercy is weakness? The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting for an answer that would either satisfy their need for authenticity or confirm their worst suspicions about the woman standing before them. Bondi looked out over the crowd, seeing faces that reflected pain, hope, anger, and desperate need for understanding. The moment stretched on, heavy with expectation and possibility. Everything that happened next would determine whether this evening would be remembered as just another political event or as something much more significant. The stage was set for what would either be her greatest failure or her most important moment. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Pam Bondi stood at the podium, her knuckles white from gripping its edges, staring out at hundreds of faces that demanded an answer she wasn't sure she could give. A question about her own child hung in the air like a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Then something shifted in her expression. The carefully maintained mask of political composure began to crack, and for the first time all evening the audience saw something real flickering behind her eyes. "Please," she said softly, raising one hand. Her voice had lost its practiced politician's cadence and had become something more human, more vulnerable. "Please, just give me a moment." The room remained dead quiet. Even the cameras seemed to stop their mechanical whirring as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Bondi stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the edge of the stage where she could see individual faces more clearly. She looked down at her hands for a moment, gathering herself, then lifted her head to meet the eyes of the young mother, who had asked the devastating question. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "You asked me what I would do if it was my child," she began, her words careful but no longer calculated. "And I need to be honest with you. For 8 years as Attorney General, I told myself that the law was the law, that justice had to be blind, that personal feelings couldn't enter into it." She paused, swallowing hard. Several people in the front row leaned forward, sensing that something important was happening. But standing here tonight, looking at all of you, hearing your stories, your pain, your questions about who I really am, ... double quotes. She shook her head slowly. I realize I've been hiding behind that philosophy because it was easier than facing the truth about some of the decisions I made. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. This wasn't the defensive deflection they had expected. This was something entirely different. Bondi walked to the other side of the small stage, her movements less controlled than before. "The truth is, I did care about my win record. I did worry about looking soft on crime. I did make decisions based on political calculations instead of always asking myself what would truly serve justice." The admission hit the room like a thunderbolt. You could hear people drawing in breath, see others exchanging glances of shock. Even the moderator looked surprised by this sudden turn toward raw honesty. "And yes," Bondi continued, her voice growing stronger even as it became more emotional, "if it had been my child, my brother, my nephew who made a terrible mistake at 17, I would have moved heaven and earth to get them a second chance. I would have argued for mercy. I would have begged for understanding." She stopped walking and faced the crowd directly. "Which makes me a hypocrite for not extending that same compassion to your children." The words hung in the air like a confession. In church, some people looked stunned. Others nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. The young mother who had asked the question was crying quietly, her baby still in her arms. Bondi's voice became even more intimate, as if she was speaking to each person individually rather than addressing a crowd. "I want to tell you about something that happened to me 3 years ago after I left office. I was at a grocery store just doing normal shopping when a woman approached me." She closed her eyes briefly, as if seeing the memory play out again. She was probably in her 50s, nicely dressed, the kind of person you'd see at any PTA meeting or church social. She walked right up to me and said, "You destroyed my grandson's life." The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Every person was completely focused on her words. I started to give her my usual response about following the law and protecting society, but she cut me off. She said he was 18 years old. He made one stupid decision when he was scared and desperate, and your office made sure he would pay for it for the rest of his life. Bondi's voice cracked slightly. Then she showed me a picture on her phone. It was a young man in a cap and gown, graduating from high school. She said, "This is who he was before you decided he was irredeemable." He was going to study engineering. He wanted to build bridges. Several people in the audience were wiping their eyes now. The hostility that had filled the room earlier was transforming into something else entirely. I stood there in that grocery store, holding a box of cereal, looking at a picture of a kid who looked like he could have been anyone's son, anyone's brother. And for the first time, I really understood what my decisions had cost. Not in terms of crime statistics or conviction rates, but in terms of human dreams and human potential. She walked back toward the center of the stage, her movements slower and more thoughtful. That grandmother looked me in the eye and said something I'll never forget. She said, "I hope you never have to feel what it's like to watch someone you love give up on themselves because the system gave up on them first." The emotion in the room was palpable now. Even people who had come ready to challenge her were listening with something approaching empathy. I went home that day and I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. I started pulling files from cases I had handled, reading the details I had glossed over before, looking at the people behind the crimes instead of just the crimes themselves. Bondi paused, looking around the room at faces that were no longer hostile but were genuinely listening. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that justice isn't just about punishment. It's supposed to be about healing, about restoration, about giving people the chance to become better than their worst moments. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I had become so focused on being tough that I forgot to be human. I had convinced myself that mercy was weakness, when the truth is that real strength lies in knowing when to show compassion. The transformation in the room was remarkable. The angry energy had shifted into something more complex, more nuanced. People were no longer seeing her as an enemy to be defeated, but as a human being grappling with difficult truths about herself. "So, when you ask me about my beliefs," she said, addressing the woman who had posed that crucial question earlier, "here's what I believe now. I believe that people are more than their worst decisions. I believe that an 18-year-old who makes a terrible mistake deserves a chance to prove they can do better. I believe that justice without mercy isn't justice at all." The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of people processing something profound, something that was changing their understanding not just of Pam Bondi, but of what it meant to truly reckon with one's past mistakes and grow from them. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the tense, waiting for battle silence from before. It was the kind of quiet that happens when people are truly listening, when something important is being shared. Pam Bondi stood on that stage, having just opened her heart in a way that surprised everyone, including herself, but she wasn't finished. Something in her expression suggested there was more to come, something deeper that she had never shared publicly before. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the packed room. "Something I've never talked about in any interview or speech. Something that happened early in my career that I've spent years trying to forget." She walked to the edge of the stage again, closer to the people who had been challenging her just minutes before. The cameras focused on her face, capturing every emotion as it flickered across her features. It was 1998. I was a young prosecutor, fresh out of law school, full of ambition, and absolutely certain I knew the difference between right and wrong. She paused, looking down at her hands. A case came across my desk that seemed straightforward. A 19-year-old had been caught selling drugs near a school. The evidence was clear, the law was clear, and I was determined to make my mark. The audience leaned in, sensing that this story would be different from anything they had heard before. The young man's name was David. He came from a family that had struggled for generations. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. His father had left when he was 12. David had been accepted to community college, but he couldn't afford the tuition, and he made the worst decision of his life to try to make quick money. Bondi's voice grew softer, more reflective. When I met with David and his mother for the plea hearing, I saw something that should have changed everything. Here was a kid who was genuinely remorseful, who understood the gravity of what he had done, who wanted nothing more than a chance to make things right. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if she was back in that courthouse 25 years ago. His mother begged me to consider alternatives to prison. She brought letters from his high school teachers, from his pastor, from neighbors who had known him his whole life. They all said the same thing. This wasn't who David really was. This was a good kid who had made a terrible mistake. The room was completely still. Even the baby that had been fussing earlier had gone quiet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. But I was 26 years old and convinced that being tough was the same as being right. I looked at that mother, with tears streaming down her face, and I told her that the law was the law. I recommended the maximum sentence, 3 to 5 years in state prison. You could hear people breathing, but nothing else. The weight of the story was settling over the audience like a heavy blanket. The judge followed my recommendation. David was sentenced to 4 years. I remember feeling proud of myself, thinking I had struck a blow for justice and law and order. Her voice cracked. I was so young and so foolish. Bondi turned to face a different section of the audience, making eye contact with people who had been her harshest critics earlier in the evening. 2 years later, I got a phone call that changed my life forever. David had been killed in prison. He was 21 years old. He had been trying to stay out of trouble, keeping his head down. But prison is a dangerous place for young, nonviolent offenders. A gasp went through the crowd. Several people covered their mouths in shock. The young mother, holding her baby, began crying quietly. I drove to the funeral, Bondi continued, her voice steady but filled with pain. I don't know why I went. Maybe I felt I owed it to him somehow. I sat in the back of that small church and watched his mother grieve for her son. She paused, gathering herself before continuing. After the service, his mother saw me. I expected her to be angry, to blame me for what happened. But she just walked up to me and said, I hope you learned something from this. Then she handed me a letter David had written to me from prison. Bondi reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. The sight of it caused another ripple of emotion through the crowd. I've carried this letter with me for over 20 years. David wrote it 6 months before he died. He said, he didn't blame me for doing my job, but he wanted me to know that he wasn't just a case file. He was a person with dreams and hopes and people who loved him. Her hands shook slightly as she held the envelope. He wrote about wanting to get his degree when he got out. He wrote about wanting to work with kids who were heading down the same path he had taken. He wrote about how prison had taught him that second chances were precious gifts that not everyone gets. The room was filled with the kind of silence that comes when people are confronting something that challenges everything they thought they knew. At the end of the letter, David wrote something that has haunted me every day since. He said, I hope that someday you'll remember that every person who comes before you is somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's hope for the future. Bondi looked up from the letter, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I failed David, I failed his mother. I failed everyone who believed that the justice system could be both firm and fair. I was so focused on being tough that I forgot to be human. She carefully put the letter back in her pocket. That's when I started to understand that real justice isn't about punishment for its own sake. It's about protecting society while still recognizing the humanity in everyone who comes before the court. It's about understanding that a 19-year-old who makes a desperate mistake shouldn't have his entire future erased. The transformation in the room was remarkable. People who had come ready for a fight were now seeing a woman who had been carrying the weight of a terrible mistake for decades, who had learned hard lessons about the cost of putting politics and ambition ahead of compassion. I spent the rest of my career trying to honor David's memory by being the prosecutor I should have been for him. I started programs for first-time offenders, I fought for drug courts that focused on treatment instead of just punishment. I pushed for reforms that gave young people second chances. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. But I also know that nothing I did later could bring David back or give his mother the son she lost. The best I could do was try to make sure that other families didn't have to go through what they went through because of my decisions. The room remained silent, but it was the silence of people who had just witnessed something profound. A public figure had stripped away all pretense and shared the most painful chapter of her life, not to make excuses but to show how tragedy had taught her to be better. The silence that followed Pam Bondi's revelation about David felt like it could last forever. Hundreds of people sat frozen in their seats, processing what they had just heard. The story of a young man who died in prison because of a decision made by an ambitious prosecutor had hit the room like a physical blow. Bondi stood on the stage, having just shared the most painful secret of her professional life. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight she had been carrying for 25 years had finally been acknowledged. She looked exhausted, but also somehow lighter, like someone who had finally told the truth after decades of carrying it. Alone, the first movement came from the back of the room. An elderly man in a cardigan slowly rose to his feet. He didn't say anything, didn't make any noise. He just stood there, looking at the woman on stage who had just laid her soul bare in front of a room full of strangers. For a moment, nothing else happened. The man stood alone while everyone else remained seated, creating an image that the news cameras captured but that felt too private to be filmed. Then, gradually, others began to stand. The young mother with the baby stood up, tears still streaming down her face. The college students who had come to challenge Bondi's record stood up. The retired police officer who had questioned her integrity stood up. One by one, row by row, people rose from their seats. It wasn't the angry, defiant standing of protesters. It wasn't the enthusiastic jumping up of supporters at a rally. It was something much more profound and much more rare. It was the recognition of shared humanity, the acknowledgement that everyone in that room had made mistakes they wished they could take back. As more people stood, a soft sound began to emerge from the crowd. It started as a whisper, barely audible, but it grew steadily stronger. Someone was clapping. Then another person joined in. Then another. The applause wasn't loud or overwhelming at first. It was respectful, almost reverent, like the kind of clapping you might hear at a memorial service or a graduation ceremony. But as it continued, it began to build, not in volume but in meaning. Bondi looked out at the standing crowd with wonder and disbelief. She had expected anger, perhaps even hatred, when she told David's story. She had prepared herself for accusations and condemnation. She had never imagined this kind of response. The woman who had asked about her core beliefs earlier in the evening was now standing and clapping, her expression completely transformed from the hostility she had shown before. The man who had questioned how she could sleep at night was on his feet, nodding slowly as he applauded. The applause continued for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. When it finally began to fade, people didn't immediately sit down. They remained standing as if they weren't ready to break the spell that had been cast over the room. Patricia Williams, the moderator, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I've been covering politics and public events for 30 years. She said into the microphone, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like what just happened here tonight." The crowd murmured in agreement. Many people were wiping their eyes. Others were looking around the room as if seeing their neighbors for the first time. The division and hostility that had filled the space earlier seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something much more powerful. Bondi finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said simply. "I wasn't sure I would ever have the courage to tell that story, but I'm glad I did." David deserved to have his story told, a voice called out from the middle of the room. "Thank you for your honesty." It was the teacher who had asked about juvenile justice earlier. It takes real courage to admit when you're wrong, especially in front of all these people. Other voices joined in, offering words of support and understanding. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. Where there had been anger and suspicion, There was now empathy and respect. An older woman near the front raised her hand. "Miss Bondi," she said when acknowledged, "I lost my grandson to drugs 5 years ago. For a long time, I was angry at everyone in the system who I thought had failed him. But listening to you tonight, I realized that we're all just human beings, trying to do our best with difficult situations." The woman paused, her voice wavering slightly. "I want you to know that sharing David's story, admitting your mistakes, that takes the kind of character I wish more of our leaders had." The applause started again, but this time it was different. It was warmer, more personal, like the kind of clapping you might give a friend who had just accomplished something difficult and meaningful. Bondi stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage again. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I'm not telling you David's story to make myself look better or to excuse the decisions I made. I'm telling it because his life mattered and because I hope it might help prevent other young people from ending up in situations where they feel they have no choice but to make desperate decisions." She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "And I'm telling it because I believe that real leadership means being willing to admit when you're wrong and to learn from your mistakes, even when it's painful." The questions that followed were completely different from the hostile challenges that had begun the evening. People asked thoughtful questions about reform, about second chances, about how to balance public safety with compassion. The conversation had shifted from attack and defense to genuine dialogue about complex issues. A young man who had been sitting quietly in the back finally spoke up. "Miss Bondi, what would you say to someone like David today? Someone who's facing the same kind of desperate situation?" Bondi thought for a moment before answering. "I would tell them that their life has value, that one mistake doesn't define who they are, and that there are people who want to help them find better solutions. I would tell them that the system isn't perfect, but there are people working to make it better." She paused, looking directly at the young man. "And I would tell them that someone once told me that every person who comes before the court is somebody's son or daughter, somebody's hope for the future. I would want them to know that they matter." The evening officially ended an hour later, but people didn't want to leave. Small groups formed throughout the room, continuing conversations that had started during the question and answer session. Former opponents were talking to each other like old friends. The young mother with the baby was speaking with the retired police officer. The college students were deep in conversation with community leaders. Bondi spent another hour after the official program ended, talking one-on-one with people who approached her. She listened to their stories, answered their questions, and accepted their thanks with grace and humility. As the community center finally began to empty, the feeling in the room was completely different from what anyone had expected. People left not with their minds changed about specific policies or positions, but with their hearts open to the possibility that real leadership sometimes means admitting your failures and showing others how to learn from them. The evening had become something much more than a political event. It had become a lesson in the power of authentic vulnerability, in the courage required to face your worst mistakes, and in the healing that can happen when people choose to see each other's humanity instead of just their differences.